Hey, what's going on, guys? I decided to do a video for updating based upon new set releases for the basic series, just so that as you're running through the videos, you can actually update with new cards that come out and a little bit of relevancy behind each individual card. Because as things update, new things come out, we get more tools to play with. So I wanted to make sure that as long as you're going through the series, you stay up to date. So I decided that it's better to do this in simple form with just, pictures and stuff and talk about the cards. So the first one that we're going to talk about and how it's relevant to Riptide is Sound the Alarm. It's a card that's very misleading up front that makes you think, oh, this is perfect for Riptide. But the fundamental problem with this card is that one, it is a one cost. So it being a one cost is just kind of not as efficient because if we have stuff for aggro that are one cost, we're just going to run our major arrows at one cost, like Sleep Dart or stuff like Withering Shot, depending on the meta. And the biggest issue behind it is that the matchups that we would run this, that we would actually extract value out of, are reaction based decks. Reaction based decks are incredibly favored for pretty much every version of Riptide. So as a result, this card kind of becomes a redundancy of we bring it in for those matchups that we already have good favored into. This could very well become a good card later, but as it stands now, it's kind of counterintuitive to what we need, but it's something to keep on the radar and just go ahead and pick up your set because it's rare. This one's easy. Pretty much every version of Riptide likes this card. The reason being is because it is still 0 for 4, so it's still just efficient in that metric. The instant part of preventing the one extra damage in decks like aggro, that can kind of sometimes matter because like you can cover some breakpoints and block a little bit more efficiently off of two cards, so that you can 2 card 7. I don't know how this plays too much into aim, but it's still just a 0 for 4, and aim likes some 0 for 4 sometimes, so it ends up doing pretty good in there. But this influences the fatigue style or the mid-range style of Riptide because we have a consistent amount of 3 blocks with traps that doing this to cover those weird breakpoints so that we don't have to give a whole nother card on, say, a snatch is insane. It makes things so much easier. Um, and I'm saying in a snatch whenever you have other on hits throughout the rest of the turn. So this card is very straightforward. It's good. It does pretty much everything that Riptide wants in almost every version of the build. Calming Breeze is kind of in that same metric, but this card kind of became a little inefficient once the shelter came out. In certain builds, you could justify running this if you really need to block those breakpoints, and depending on how the meta shifts. And this is a somewhat decent fitting this specific role instead of a 0 for 4 if you don't want Sink Below, or you already run Sink Below and you want something like this. It fits that role pretty well. So it's just a rare, pretty easy. This is another one of those cards that you just kind of add to your toolbox. You may not use it, but it's right there. It's easy. This is more a card that we're going to talk about as a counter to Riptide. So this card isn't as good as people may think for against Riptide, but it is a card that by nature is rough because obviously, DReacts not being able to be played can sometimes be rough. But the fundamental issue with this card is that it takes tempo away, it doesn't block, and it's a one of. So aggro style Riptides don't really run as many traps. So this card kind of just says, I hope that I get it to plan well and that you actually have traps in hand. And sometimes aggro is just going to be like, okay. But against the more fatigue variants, then this tends to do a lot better. But then you're taking a gamble and you're running a card that is somewhat easy to get rid of off of, say, a collapsing trap or battering bolt, or even a weakest link. So this is a card to be aware of, and if your local meta thinks really highly of you as a Riptide, and they really, really want to see you go down, they might start running this. So just be aware of it. Understand that this does exist. And if you think that people are going to target you, try to play around it a little bit. But this is a good card to just keep aware of. Chain reaction is the most polarizing opinions that most people have right now of this card. So by nature, this card is not ideal right now. It has very limited abilities for it to be efficient. It is just a yellow 0 for 3. If it does go again, 0 for 4 with the ping, which is okay. That's not bad. There are definitely things that are better, but I can see the justification of running it sometimes. However, I want to make sure that people are clear. The reason for running this card has not actually really been playing Codex or playing Plan for the Worst or, God forbid, Three of a Kind. This card off of Three of a Kind requires you to play Tunic, which then only nets you one card off the exchange, and Riptide has a somewhat hard ability to actually utilize their full hand of arrows and traps. You might get lucky and get a bunch of buffs and then one arrow, but realistically, that's not going to happen. So this card is only really good off of Codex of Inertia, Codex of Bloodrot, and Plan for the Worst. The codexes are kind of gimmicky. That play pattern is interesting, but it doesn't actually yield as good a results as you would want. Plan for the Worst can do well, but it is a situation where you have to have both and you have to play it in the correct way for it to utilize the effects efficiently. It's good. This card isn't bad. This is definitely if it's $1 or $2 card, pick it up now because this seems like a card that they intentionally printed beforehand in the hope that the stuff that they print makes this usable. This is definitely a card that is good to look for. Right now, I wouldn't worry too much about this card. I don't think it's going to make waves. I don't think it's even going to make it into most lists. But it's interesting. Enchanted Quiver is a odd one, just like all the other ones in the set of Hunted, where they give this odd support where it's kind of spell void, but not really spell void. So this quiver is only really good in the event that you have a face-up arrow. Aggro tends to be the deck that's able to bank arrows against decks that this would matter against more often than, say, Fatigue. So what this ends up slotting in as is do I want to run Spell Void Run 1 against Arcane decks? And there's Arcane decks you don't usually want Quiver, or at least a lot of them you don't want Quiver of Abyssal. So then this slots in there without actually taking any of your other slots, like your headpiece or your boots, to make your equipment usage better, because you're almost never using Abyssal in this type of matchups, especially against Kano. So the floor of this card is very good if that's what you need. The ceiling of this card is really good because Spell Void 2 turns out it's pretty good. We saw that with Lexi and Shock Charmers. This is a really good card for aggro because of the fact that you can reliably do the Spell Void 2. And sometimes it comes down to the 1 to 2 points into that matchup. I don't think this makes huge waves into how Riptide approaches the Kano matchup, but I definitely think if you feel like you have one slot left and you know there's going to be a couple Kano there, and you want something to increase your overall matchup spread, this is a solid card because it will help against Kano. It'll help a little bit against, say, Aura or Viscerai, and somewhat can help against Vincent. This is a card you're probably going to be able to pick up again for $1 or $2. I don't think this is a bad pickup in the slightest. I think it has its usability. It's just a matter of when. And the last card we're going to talk about. This card is pretty much the biggest one in the set outside of Shelter that has changed a lot of things that we approach. So before we looked at the Riptide decks on a mid-range fatigue being kind of just as mid-range fatigue and having more ability to block, but less offensive ability, which makes sense, obviously. But with Quickdodge Flexors, you're able to convert blues in your hand into massive blocks and mitigating damage on a certain turn if you really need to maintain tempo, which was probably one of the biggest issues. Also, in these really go wide decks that you have to deal with a lot, you're able to convert even more of your cards in hand into just efficient blocks to either prevent fatigue on yourself or just in general cover these breakpoints that you have a little bit of trouble covering as Riptide, again, 0 for 3s. So this card has revolutionized how the mid-range fatigue list for Riptide works. AIM can probably use this efficiently because they can kind of work around with their Riptide ability and flipping off of Barbed to then at least come back with, say, a Stone Rain for 4 Dominate on hit effect. So the only one that this isn't really going to affect too much is like pure redline aggro because, well, obviously having reds tends to make this card a little less efficient. So most of those decks, if they need block power, are going to opt for Perch Grapplers because you can actually sometimes use Perch Grapplers offensively, and that ends up working better for that type of deck. Alternatively, they usually just end up using snaps if they don't care about a block whatsoever. So this card is incredible to pick up if you're playing anything other than aggro as Riptide. It enables so much efficiency in the deck, which is literally how Riptide functions as a hero, is squeezing every bit of value in offense and defensive capability and trying to maintain your tempo with on hits that are relevant while still mitigating what the opponent can actually do. So those are pretty much all the relevant cards. There's a couple that people think could be played, but for the most part, they end up not doing anything that you want, like this being just plain inefficient than just a arrow, or stuff like Rotten that we can't actually utilize. But for the most part, Riptide got a decent buff this set, and I look forward to seeing what we'll see in the next one when we eventually get that Ranger set. But keep watching, keep learning. See you next time.